Hello again. That's quite orange. I've got my orange lamp on here. This crystal lamp. I look very orange. I thought I'd do a little video about some gay novels. I don't think, talked about gay fiction on this. Quite hard to choose what I'm going to talk about, really. I think I'm going to confine myself to the 1990s, which was when I was in my 20s and first reading gay fiction. And it was a big deal to read books with gay fellas as the lead characters, as out gay men being the authors of these. Bookshops used to have LGBT, I don't think they were even called that, the gay section in Waterstones and so on. Something that's kind of vanished now. There's good and bad things about that. I think it was useful to have that section. This was one of the first books I had that was specifically gay. Something I was very wary of having at home because it's such a giveaway. The thing about gay stuff is, at least then, to own it was to be it. Really, you were so careful to, if you weren't out, so careful not to give yourself away. You got used to hiding things so as not to cause upset. I'm sure it is different and better now. I think. I don't know. I hope so. This was a present from a boyfriend who had been my Shakespeare professor at university. He very sweetly offered me out on a date on the day that I got my first in English, when the results went up on the board, and took me out and properly paid court. I'd never had that before. I was 21, I guess. He was a bit older. I think he was twice my age. Very glamorous, very clever, and gave me this as a gift, this kind of entree into contemporary gay fiction. And a lot of names here that would mean a lot later on. Ormiston Maupin and Paul Bailey, Edmund White. It's a Faber collection, so it's very proper. And the fact they even did a gay anthology was a big deal. This was 91, so it was the very year. This is the first edition. Pierre and Gilles card. Yeah, happy memories, and of course it's got that fabulous drawing by Hockney on the front, which again was such a giveaway. It was a book with somebody's willy on the cover. So through the 90s, I read all kinds of people. I mean, mostly I read women, to be honest. My eventual research that I did for my PhD was Angela Carter and lots of usually female theorists on gender and magical realism and all those things that I was interested in, drag and fantasy. But I always read the gay fellas too. So here's just a few names that leap out of the 1990s. Michael Carson, who was published by Black Swan, which was a publishing list that I absolutely loved. I loved everything they did. I loved their font, and I keep saying that. Black Swan had beautiful layouts for their books. Now, Michael Carson wrote, it was a kind of a sequence. It was a young Catholic lad, wasn't it? Benson is fat, 14, and inspired with Catholic fervour. His dream of heaven is a place where Mars bars grow on trees. Benson is a founder member of the Rude Club, at whose meetings irregular motions of the flesh set off attacks of guilt and send him scurrying to confession. See, all the Catholic stuff I never got. I wasn't brought up religious at all, so that stuff never meant so much to me, although I did understand guilt and symbolism. But But these I remember being funny. I read a number of these in this series. I think I went back to them and tried to read them again, and didn't get very far. Sometimes the books you read early on don't stand up when you return to them. Something that did was A Sense of Touch, which I read 2 or 3 times over the years. This is by Christopher Osborne. I might have talked about this on this channel. It's about a pianist, a gay pianist. It's a very well-to-do family. There are bits in Italy. It's very lush and beautifully written. There's some tense and very sensual moments in the kind of cruising scenes. I remember those being quite exciting. Of course, people read the gay books for the rude bits as well. Somewhere I've got my Alan Hollinghurst books. I know my friend John has had my copy of The Swimming Pool Library for most of a year, and I've not had it back, and I need it back. That was a book with lots of rude bits in it, as Hollinghurst always has. He writes very well about sex. I was aware, I guess, that lots of these books were about posh people. That was just a given. I mean, most literary books were about posh people. That was something you come to realise when you start reading seriously. And very few people who come from where you come from. And that's still not been rectified. They make noises all the time about the kind of bookish equivalent of levelling up, of trying to find out, how do we get more working class voices into fiction? I love that quote, I think by Ian Rankin, where he said, working class voices are all here, they're just working in genres like crime and horror and science fiction, because they're not welcome in literary fiction. And I think there's some truth in that. But for a while, when I did my first novels, it felt like they were welcome. They were on a level playing field with Hollinghurst, who of course published me the first time I was published. He chose a story of mine, him and A.S. Byatt. Anyway, the kind of poshery is slightly annoying. Here's somebody posh. That's about very posh people. Christopher Coe, I Look Divine, which I've read a number of times over the years. Nicholas was young, clever, rich, and very beautiful, and he prized his graceful looks above everything. Even as a child, he knew exactly how he wanted to be seen, how to be cherished and adored. In his teens and 20s, he travelled the world with his elder brother, flirting and posing, accepting as tributes the precious gifts lavished upon him by admirers. In Rome, Madrid, and Mexico, they drank cocktails in glamorous hotel bars and went on to nightclubs where the beautiful men danced alone in front of mirrors, entranced by their own reflections. But then the beauty faded, catching him almost unawares and leaving him in a room where reflected images of a younger Nicholas watched from the walls. I've read this a few times, and it's beautifully written, and I don't care if they're poshos or whatever they are. I love the travel around the world. The thing about people dancing in front of mirrors is really funny, because when we went to the Tabasco nightclub in about 2000, which is in Palazzo Vecchio in Florence, underneath the square, underneath Michelangelo's David, there is a gay bar called Tabasco. Lorna Sage told us it was there. She said she once lost her handbag there in the 70s. And there was a dance floor, and it was mirrored, and all the Italian men danced with themselves, and there was mist running down the mirrors, condensation, and all they wanted to look at was themselves as they danced. One way of avoiding the endless parade of posh people going around the world is to read novels by Australians and Americans. This is Graham Aitkins' 50 Ways of Saying Fabulous, another novel about growing up. Meet sweet, fat, theatrical Billy Boy. He was never cut out to be a farmer, but as his father's only son, he's obliged to try. The cows are wayward, the chores are grueling, and Billy escapes into a fantasy world where a lavender bed jacket becomes a slinky spacesuit, a cow's tail a head of beautiful blonde hair, and where Billy can become Judy Robinson, the heroine of Lost in Space. Yep, I remember loving this. It's one to put on the reread pile, I think. This is something I read when I was about 12. I read it down the burn in our town, up a tree, with my friend Michael, who was straight, but we both loved the sexy scenes in this coming out novel. We'd also read Harold Robbins that was full of straight scenes, very sexy scenes. He'd pinched it from his mother's bedroom, and we read a terrible Harold Robbins novel about a woman being kidnapped and unspeakable things happening. And I didn't find that particularly arousing. But then we read In the Tent, which is about 4 teenagers going away for a weekend and being stuck in a tent, and various saucy conversations happening. There are kind of time travel flashbacks to the Civil War. David Rees is a really interesting writer. He was published by the Gay Men's Press for his adult books, and I've got a few of them. I like his stories, and there's another novel called The Milkman's on His Way. So he was somebody writing gay fiction for teens in, I think, the late 70s. 79 this was, so it wasn't very old when I read it. It was in the children's section of Newton Aycliffe Town Library, and I was amazed to find it. It has life-changing moments, actually. The bits where the boys talk about their sexuality, and I wish I could find it, where one realises that he's inadvertently come out to the other one who he suspects might be gay, and one asks the other one, does it show? Can you tell? And there's a bit where they move their sleeping bags closer. It's... yeah. The bit where they climb inside sleeping bags together. Very hot. At least it was, to be reading it at the age of whatever, 12, when you'd never read anything like it. And it's all so tame. You think about what straight books are like for people of the same age, the stuff that goes on, what's taken for granted in the straight world takes on so much more of a charge when it's forbidden, which it was. It felt forbidden, especially in the 1980s when I was growing up, when you had vile, senseless, evil things like the Tory party's Section 28, which forbade discussion of homosexuality in schools and public places, basically. Philip Ridley, Crocodilia, is a gay novel published by Brilliance Books in 1988. He's a wonderful surrealist, punky, queer writer who wrote kids' books like Crindle Cracks and many others. He's a playwright as well. A real original. And this I didn't find for many years, actually. It's his first book. Another kind of very idiosyncratic novel. Now, Americans. David Levitt, this is just one example of his books I've read a lot. I stopped in more recent years, I have to say. This is an early novel, I think it is, rather than a collection of stories. Yes, it's one of his early novels. He did The Lost Language of the Cranes, which became a wonderful TV movie with Eileen Atkins. I saw that again. Sorry, my battery's going. I saw that again in recent times. It was on BBC 4, 30 years on from it first being on. At the time, it was such a amazing TV movie because it had, gay fellas talking in a very kind of authentic way, really, and within a family where everything was a bit difficult. And it had nudity, which was a big deal. The kind of things that you would stay up late to see in Derek Jarman movies on Channel 4. So that set me off reading David Levitt, and I read everything. He's a very interesting writer, in love with Europe, I guess. He writes about Florence. There's a book about Italy. He's a bit literary in quotes, with everything that means. But sometimes the fiction can be a bit pleased with itself, I think. While England Sleeps, which was revised heavily to remove or change a character who was based on a real person. I've got the original copy that came out and was then taken out of circulation. I bought it very early, and I love that book. I think it's a flashback to the 1930s, but he lives in that world. He inhabits the past so well, and maybe I should return to him and read him again. Maybe it's about time I read David Levitt again. So I'm reminding myself with this who it was I liked. Now, Edmund White. This was a very famous book cover for gay readers of the 90s. A Boy's Own Story is his, I think, autobiographical novel about a boy coming out, slightly spoiled boy. He falls into company with older people who, there's a beautiful bit in a bar, and he describes it as being like inside an aquarium. It's so dark and muggy. It's Picador, so there's no actual synopsis on the back. You get long reviews by people, long blurbs, which always annoyed me about Picador books. They never told you what the bloody book was about. This was very sexy, very explicit, and one of the books that you read to find out what people did, because there was no education. You read fiction to find out what people did in bed, what you were supposed to do. I've said it before, there's no education. People learn to be gay by themselves. They learn who that person is they might be, and eventually they meet other people. And I think this still happens today, when things are more different, but in some ways they're despecified now, that we have lots and lots of talk of gender and sexuality, but we don't have much talk of actual sex. And what they should have been teaching us are about things like safe sex, things that were important to learn about for teenagers in the 90s, in the 80s, and now, in the 2000s and 20s, whatever we are now. It's still very important that people are educated. But we went off to find out this stuff wherever we could, and we were grateful to people like Edmund White for telling us things about how it all works. As the sequel, The Beautiful Room is Empty. This is the 1950s. He's back in the 1950s. In some ways, the fact that people were writing about the 50s but doing it in the 80s, which was similarly repressive in some ways, was useful. White is a very ornate, mannered writer, which suits some people and not others. He writes really beautifully, but it can be a little bit overly ornate, perhaps. He loves dwelling in the moment. Again, I've not read his recent novels. I've read the memoirs that he did in recent years about cities, about New York City, and his autobiography. I realise I haven't got Armistead Maupin on in this pile of gay books. He should be there. And so should Patrick Gale. But I've talked about them recently in different things. Both people I read in the 90s and who were important to my development in all kinds of ways. A more recent fella is Bob Smith, who I got to know. He's a New York writer who I met in New York after we'd become friends, I think through Facebook and things. I read this novel, Selfish and Perverse, 2010. I don't know what came first, actually. but I read all of his other things, his autobiographical essays. He was a stand-up comedian as well, and hilarious. And his essays are hilarious. A bit like David Sedaris. Again, somebody who could be in this list. But Bob's novels are generous. He's died in recent years, about 5 years ago maybe. And his novels are generous and big and funny. This is one about going from Los Angeles to Alaska and falling in love. There's a very hot threesome somewhere in this book, I remember. I love the stuff about Alaska as well because it reminds me of Northern Exposure, one of my favourite TV shows. Anyway, Bob's from the 2000s rather than the 90s, but as time goes on, these periods become closer together. He's definitely of a piece with these wonderful gay writers I've been talking about. Anyway, that's everything for this video for now. I might talk some more about this. It's interesting getting into the idea of gay fiction as a genre in itself. It's not yes, it is different. It is different because it's about different expectations for what a genre does. Gay people aren't the same, and their stories aren't the same as as straight people. Right, but that's it for tonight and this particular episode. I'll see you again. I hope the lighting's not too distractingly weird in this. I've got a big halo over my head. Anyway, goodbye, and I'll see you again soon in the next episode.